Good day. Our program will begin in just a moment. Good day. Our program will begin in just a moment. Good day. Welcome to Advocacy Anywhere, Israel at War, a new series featuring weekly programs surrounding the evolving situation in Israel and Gaza, understanding its impact around the world, and sharing action items you can take from wherever you are. Since Hamas's horrific terrorist attack in Israel on October 7th, there has been continued demonization and delegitimization of the Jewish state, a dangerous rise in anti-Semitism globally, as well as widespread misunderstanding of Israel's obligations under international law. Here to help us unpack the complexities of this conflict is Matthew Waxman, Adjunct Senior Fellow for Law and Foreign Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations and a Professor of Law at Columbia Law School. Moderating our conversation today is AJC Chief Field Operations Officer Melanie Marin-Pell. After we hear from Professor Waxman, time permitting, we will take your questions. You may email your question to questions@ajc.org, questions is plural, or you can use the Q&A feature in Zoom. Melanie, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Claire, and welcome, Professor Waxman. We really appreciate you being here with us today. We're at this time when suddenly every person that has a keyboard or an Instagram account presumes themselves to be an expert on international law. So it's really important for our audience to hear from you, a credentialed expert in this field. So to begin, we've all heard Secretary Blinken say that Israel has a right and indeed a responsibility to defend its citizens. But how they do it matters. Blinken and other officials have referred to the laws of war, the rules of war, and rule of law. Others refer to the Geneva Conventions or the law of armed conflict, the Hague Conventions, other international humanitarian law. There are many terms that are being thrown around. So can you help us understand what actually are the laws governing warfare and how do they apply in the current war between Israel and Hamas? So what body of law is relevant?
Sure. So first of all, thanks for having me. It's great to speak to your audience, especially about these issues that, are, as you say, are very much at the fore, but are not always so well understood. So maybe I'll make some general points, and then we can go into some of the specifics that you mentioned. But we are talking here about the laws of war, and often the more technical term is the law of armed conflict or international humanitarian law. And I would begin this way, that on October 7th, we saw some what were unquestionably and unspeakably war crimes, massacring civilians, taking hostages, rape, killing and abducting babies with real sadistic savagery and genocidal intent. A lot of focus on those attacks, but at the same time, we saw thousands of rockets fired indiscriminately at populated areas in Israel. So I'll argue that Israel is justified in waging a self-defensive war on a major scale. If international law didn't allow states to defend themselves in situations like this, the law would collapse. International law would collapse. And I would put it at the most general level. I would say this, that the core idea of the law of armed conflict, the laws of war, is that they balance, on the one hand, military necessity, the need to wage war or defend yourself effectively, with humanitarian considerations, including protection of civilians, the wounded, and so on. And much of this law then is distilled down in a couple of specific principles, and perhaps we could take those in turn and then apply them to some specific circumstances and some specific controversies. One is the principle of distinction. You can't deliberately target civilians. The second is the principle of proportionality, that the expected civilian suffering of an operation can't be excessive in relation to the expected military gain. And we're talking here, and this is one of the challenges of applying these longstanding rules to urban combat in one of the most densely populated spots areas on Earth against an enemy that has not only embedded itself underground beneath the civilian population, but also continues to commit what are war crimes, and I can explain why, of using human shields and other tactics that deliberately put civilians in harm's way. I just want to make one other sort of framing point or introductory point, and that is that even as Israel wages a just war against an enemy that is grotesquely inhumane, we who support Israel must not lose our own humanity. And among other things, that means feeling and expressing sorrow and empathy for those civilians in Gaza who are innocent and who are now suffering on a very large scale.
Thank you for saying that. I think we agree. I think that is crucially important. Can we dive a little bit deeper into some of the principles of international humanitarian law that you just described? So necessity, distinction, proportionality. I think proportionality is the one we hear the most. We hear the charge levied against Israel that it is, there is disproportionate force being used. Can you just explain a little bit more about proportionality?
Sure, and maybe just to step back, this is what we law professors do, is we say, well, it's complicated. Let me step back. But we're talking here about a patchwork of treaties, including the UN Charter, the Geneva Conventions, as well as what's called customary international law, which is law based on the general practice of states. And I would distinguish between sort of two levels, two separate issues. One is a dispute about what is sometimes called the jus ad bellum, the legality of the resort to force. And the other is jus in bello, which regulates the conduct of war. Once a war is ongoing, how is that war carried out? And this is an important distinction because it sort of sets the foundation for the idea that even in a just war, one must still conduct it justly. And much of the debate that we're seeing played out today, and I think many of the questions that you probably have are about that second piece, jus in bello, or the conduct of war. How is Israel doing so? To what degree is Israel complying with the law of armed conflict? As I mentioned before, I think much of the law of armed conflict boils down to two main principles. Distinction. You can't deliberately strike military targets or personnel. Let me back that up. You may only deliberately target or strike military targets or personnel. You're prohibited from intentionally targeting civilians or civilian property. This is not a rule that civilians can't be killed incidentally. That's a tragic consequence of every war. It's a horrible consequence of this war on a very, very large scale, but it does require that civilians and civilian property not be deliberately targeted. That principle of distinction, though, also has an important corollary, which is the other side. The defender must not deliberately put civilians in harm's way, can't use human shields, can't fire rockets from mosques, schools, hospitals, use them as bases from which to conduct attacks or store military supplies. And when an adversary does so, let's say uses a hospital or a school as a base for conducting military operations, launching or storing rockets, let's say, that site loses its protected civilian status. It can now be targeted. But this brings us to the companion principle, proportionality. And the rule of proportionality, as I mentioned before, says that the anticipated civilian harm of a military operation can't be excessive to the expected military gain. Now, of course, it's not always easy to calculate either side of that balance, right? Military necessity or military gain is hard to quantify, so is civilian suffering, but this is a reasonable judgment. Commanders need to make a reasonable judgment, and different reasonable commanders or different reasonable observers will strike a different balance. They'll set some different thresholds there. But to give perhaps an easy example, you couldn't bomb an entire housing complex to take out a single sniper who's firing from it. And I wanted to just spell that out in a little bit of detail, because especially that principle of proportionality is often misstated especially in the media, as some sort of macabre comparison of body counts, sort of an eye for an eye. Hamas killed this many people, so Israel can't kill more than that. That is not how it works. The question for commanders is, what military advantage do I reasonably expect to gain from an action? And is that far outweighed by the civilian harm that I would reasonably expect to cause? That's the proportionality principle. And like I said, it is very difficult to apply these principles in urban combat. It is very hard to apply these principles against an adversary that is putting its own civilians in harm's way, and in that sense, perverting the laws of war, the law of armed conflict, for its own strategic gain, at the cost to its own civilian population that it claims to be defending.
And I want to come back to that point in a moment about Hamas's, what are its responsibilities to its people and what laws has it violated. But I want to first note that there are some who would add a fourth principle to necessity, distinction, proportionality of humanity, or responsibility. So when collateral harm is anticipated, one should attempt to minimize such harm. You alluded to that, but can you just comment on that notion?
Yeah, I mentioned distinction and proportionality because I think they're the two that do so much work of law in this area. A lot of more detailed rules kind of derive from those core ideas, and a lot of the controversy in the current war has been about the application of those two rules. But there are a couple of other principles that matter here. One is, as you say, a principle of humanity. The idea being that in carrying out military operations, you don't cause unnecessary suffering. And there's also a related principle of precautions that states are expected to take feasible measures to try to reduce civilian suffering, or what's often called collateral. I'd call it sort of unintended suffering, death, destruction of the civilian population and civilian structures.
So if we can return back to Hamas, you mentioned things like using human shields, storing weapons in civilian places like hospitals or schools or mosques. Can you walk us through a little bit of the laws that Hamas violated
Sure.
on specifically with the October 7th attacks, but also in the days before and since?
Yeah. So, the October 7th attacks themselves constituted a number of specific war crimes. And of course, Hamas is not a state, and a lot of international law is law made by states, agreed to among states. The Geneva Conventions are a treaty. You need to be a state, what we'd call a state party to that treaty. But under what I mentioned before, customary international law, even non-state actors like this that are engaged in an armed conflict, or think of a guerrilla force or something like that, are bound by certain standards and can commit war crimes. And on October 7th, we saw Hamas perpetrate a number of clear war crimes, massacring civilians, killing civilians, deliberately targeting them, war crime. Firing rockets indiscriminately at populated areas, clear war crime. All of this also perpetrated with, I would say, genocidal intent. And we might come back to that, but I think certainly the intent was genocidal, and that only adds to the heinousness and the criminality here. But you're also asking about another set of violations of the law of armed conflict, the laws of war, and even criminal violations, war crimes by Hamas, which is deliberately putting its own civilians in harm's way. One of the basic assumptions in the laws of war, the law of armed conflict, international humanitarian law, one of the basic assumptions is that military forces are going to defend their own civilians. That's kind of baked into a lot of these rules. But if a side doesn't care about its civilians, it's willing to, in fact, wants to sacrifice them for strategic gain, that can really turn some of these rules on their head. And we've seen Hamas doing that in a number of ways. We've seen Hamas using human shields, either placing its own military resources underneath or alongside civilian sites, hospitals, for example, schools, mosques, or putting civilians on top of buildings, right? And in a sense, this creates a heads I win, tails you lose kind of option that Hamas is looking to exploit. It puts these civilians in harm's way, and either Israel, the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, either decide we're not going to strike the target because that would cause widespread suffering, disproportionate collateral damage, or we still are entitled to strike the target, but Israel now bears the cost in the called court of public opinion for taking actions that results in quite a bit of tragic death, even though it's really Hamas that is putting the civilians in harm's way. And I would say that this is a problem that the international law of armed conflict doesn't really have a good answer to. I'll just leave you with one other example because it comes to this issue of humanity and precautions. Israel has has taken a lot of criticism for so-called evacuation orders of northern Gaza. I hope we might come back to this because I think that's a mischaracterization of what Israel did. But Israel has issued warnings to the population of northern Gaza, basically saying, we're going to be engaging in high intensity combat operations here, move south. One of the tactics that Hamas has engaged in is basically trying to convince those civilians to stay put. This is unfortunately a cynical and perverted way of putting its own civilians in harm's way.
And again, we'll spend a little bit more time on that in a moment. I'm wondering if you can speak to the issue of hostages. We know there are more than 240 people being held hostage in Gaza, but we know that many of them are foreign nationals from other countries. We know a number of them are IDF soldiers who were kidnapped from bases. What can you tell us about what international law says about the taking of hostages? And is there any distinction between those different categories, whether they're military, if they're part of the IDF or if they're just civilians?
It's easy. It's a war crime. Taking of hostages, civilian hostages in particular, is a war crime. The taking and capture of soldiers is a different category. Just because in warfare has the laws of war have provisions for the capture and detention of enemy fighters, and there the real rules that then kick in are treatment standards. What you do with them, where you detain them, how, for example, you would question them, what kind of care and custody do you provide for them. I think the real focus here has been on, as you say, the hundreds of civilian hostages that were taken, and that's a war crime.
And for foreign nationals, is there any distinction there, or is that
I guess I would say, from the perspective of the law of armed conflict, it's really about the taking of civilians. I would point out that just as a political and strategic matter, I don't know that Hamas was expecting to capture foreign nationals. I think this has been a strategic problem for Hamas. I think one reason why we've seen some of the releases emphasizing the foreign nationals. I don't know that it went in deliberately looking to capture foreign nationals. I suspect Hamas ended up taking a lot more hostages than it prepared for.
Well, we are working every angle we can to ensure the safe return of every single one of them.
Absolutely, and that's obviously that's a priority for not just the government of Israel and the IDF, but many of these other countries around the world whose own nationals are captured. I mean, I say especially if their own nationals are captured, but this is really a problem, I think, for the international community writ large. It does also, and I mean, this is part of the reason you take hostages, is it's a way of trying to shield targets from military destruction. And I have no doubt that the taking of hostages, perhaps keeping them in tunnels, is inhibiting Israel's ability to mount effective military operations to take out some of those targets, as it now has to worry about perhaps inadvertently killing some of the hostages.
Yes, incredibly challenging decisions to be made in these circumstances. So you referenced some of the steps and measures Israel has taken as it is defending its own citizens to try to protect and minimize the civilian casualties of Palestinians living in Gaza. Do the actions Israel has taken meet the requirements that are set forth in the laws of war? And what humanitarian obligations does Israel have to the civilian population? So, to extend that question, there's been a lot of commentary about the lack of food or electricity or gasoline or water. What is Israel's obligation to provide that kind of assistance or humanitarian aid or resources to the people of Gaza?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and it's actually a very difficult one to answer for a couple of reasons. One is, I think the law in this area isn't so clear, is contested, and I'll explain what some of those debates are. Second, some of the facts are unclear and are moving quickly. In the immediate aftermath of October 7th, Defense Minister Gallant said, we're going to mount a complete siege of Gaza. Nothing's going in or out. That was very quickly scaled back, and certain amounts of supplies were allowed and have continued to be allowed into Gaza. Not nearly enough to sustain the entire civilian population. No doubt there is tremendous civilian suffering due to deprivations of critical supplies. But I make the point that the facts are changing, and the facts are important. A third reason why it's difficult to draw clear conclusions about the so-called siege is that some of these supplies were provided by Israel. Some fuel supplies, electricity. And so it's one thing to say that a state might be required to allow others to send in electricity, fuel, food, and so on. It's quite another thing to then say that Israel, the party that's defending itself, must provide for the civilian population. But no doubt the civilian population in Gaza is suffering at a very high level. I'll make just a couple of additional points. One is, I mentioned before that the law is contested a bit when, or at least aspects of it, when it comes to so-called siege. And one of the debates is whether it matters or not what the intent of the siege is. So, for example, international law prohibits the use of starvation as a method of war. There's some debate in the international community whether that means you can't take action that results in the starvation of the civilian population, or it means you can't deliberately try to starve the civilian population, but if your intent is to prevent the food supply, the sustainment of enemy military forces, that's allowed. That's a big debate in international law, one area in which I think the law is just not clear. The last point I'll also just make on this is it's important to remember when thinking about who is responsible for the civilian suffering in Gaza, that Hamas is sitting on mountains of resources. It has been stockpiling fuel, food, medicine, and so on. And
Cash.
It is
money.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And so to say that all of the responsibility for sustaining the civilian population comes from outside parties, including Israel, to provide for the civilian population can easily obscure the fact that at any moment now, Hamas could, if it wanted to, relieve a lot of that civilian suffering. But we see an enemy here that that fuels itself first. If food is scarce, Hamas eats first. That's again the reality of this conflict. I will say I'm personally, I do think it has been a good thing that, for example, certain humanitarian relief supplies have been allowed into Gaza, especially things like medical supplies and things like that. I think it has been a good thing from a moral standpoint, from as well as a strategic standpoint, regardless of what the law does or doesn't require. And humanitarian relief supplies are sort of a special category, allowing in things like medicine to care for the sick and wounded.
So in addition to leafleting, phone calls, other ways that Israel has tried to alert the residents of Gaza in advance of some of the aerial bombardments, it's been urging residents from the northern part of the Gaza Strip to move south ahead of its now quite intense ground operation. And over the past few days, we've seen the IDF secure humanitarian corridors to enable residents to move southward. And we've also seen, and today the Times of Israel is reporting, this is absolutely infuriating Hamas, which is now accusing the United Nations agency that is responsible for Palestinian refugees, and maybe we can talk about the term refugees, that's also another issue, but they're saying they're colluding with Israel in the, quote, forced displacement of the residents of Gaza. And I'm wondering if you can comment on that tension between Hamas and the UN.
Yeah, so with regard to today's news, I'll make a general point, and then we can talk more specifically about the so-called evacuation order and the way it's been described and exploited. But if I were to offer one main takeaway from this talk today, one main takeaway I would emphasize is this is an area of law where it's important to avoid snap judgments. There are a lot of time amid the fog of war, there is misinformation. a few weeks ago, Israel was instantly and globally condemned for bombing a hospital, and it turned out that it was a missile that came from inside Gaza. Unfortunately, the way that information flows, especially the way that it flows within politically closed societies, that has become a sort of an indelible allegation against Israel. The other reason why I would avoid snap judgments is that a lot of times the facts matter. Intent matters. It matters what information a reasonable commander had or didn't have at the time, rather than looking back in hindsight. And so, you're asking about evacuation, and this is more a point about things like targeting that we might come back to. But to the naked eye, the destruction of, let's say, a civilian site could look either like an indiscriminate attack or a legitimate destruction of a military target that was shielded with humans and civilians. And you often cannot tell with just the naked eye looking at a crater and the destruction, which of those two things it was. So this is a caution about some snap judgments here. You asked about the evacuation order from the north, and I use the term evacuation order, even though I think it's a misnomer. Israel originally warned the civilians of northern Gaza to leave their homes and go south within 24 hours, though Israel quickly backed off from that time frame. That was totally impractical. This is, like I said, been described as an evacuation order. That's inaccurate in the sense that Israel does not govern northern Gaza. It can't order anything there. It has, by the way, ordered evacuations of northern Israel and southern Israel and displaced large parts of its own population, and it can order that. But what it has done is it has warned civilians in northern Gaza to move south for their own safety. This has been, I would say, understandably controversial because we're talking about around 1 million people. There's no way to do that without very widespread suffering. I do think judgment about that has been too hasty, and that Israel would have strong legal arguments to back up its actions here, so long as a few things are true. That it is not intended to permanently depopulate northern Gaza, but it's a temporary measure. That it's not intended to collectively punish civilians of Gaza. That it is intended to protect those civilians from harm that they would otherwise suffer during military operations. And that it's done in ways, this comes back to the humanity principle that you talked about before, that it's done in ways that can help mitigate, feasible ways to mitigate some of that civilian suffering. I think the strongest argument is that this is necessary to protect civilians from the urban combat and bombardment that is already occurring, and more of which is to come against an enemy that is deeply embedded in densely packed civilian areas. In fact, I would argue that if Israel didn't urge civilians to leave, it would be criticized for not taking steps to warn the citizens of northern Gaza. That's probably why Hamas is working so hard to prevent and dissuade civilians from fleeing south.
And does the UN, what is their obligation here to the residents of Gaza that, again, they're, quote, colluding with the IDF to try to move, whether temporarily, to a safer part of the territory?
Yeah, I think the way to think about this is, it's part of a disinformation campaign by Hamas to try to sow certain conspiracy theories. It is trying to paint Israeli precautionary warnings to civilians which is a way of trying to reduce civilian suffering, as essentially a plot to try to create human suffering.
There's a quote, if I may. In 2016, an Israeli diplomat at the UN stated that, quote, Israel has been threatened ceaselessly with war, terror, and destruction since its inception. But Israel's commitment to the rule of law and to those values stays firm and solid, even if this makes our struggle to counter terrorism more difficult. As former Israeli Chief Justice Aaron Barak said, and I quote, and I'm quoting a quote here, so there's lots of quoting, but quote, a democracy must sometimes fight with one hand tied behind its back. Even so, democracy has the upper hand. So again, we've spoken a little bit about this, but what happens, we're in this situation and the term asymmetrical warfare is used. One party is really abdicating any sort of adherence to the rule of law and refuses to engage or abide by them. What does that do in a conflict like this? What is the responsibility of Israel?
Yeah, I'd come back to an earlier point that, for one thing, even a just war must be conducted justly. Even a war against a grotesquely inhumane enemy must be conducted with some humanity. And Israel is a rule of law society. I will say, by the way, I say this, and I've been defending Israeli actions here and calling it, I believe it is a rule of law system. I believe it is a democracy, but it is an imperfect one. I myself find some members of the current Israeli government quite offensive. I would oppose some Israeli policies, but it is up against an enemy in this case that is truly inhumane and flouts international law at every turn. And that does, for reasons that we've talked about, put Israel at certain tactical and strategic disadvantages. As a legal matter, the fact that an enemy violates, even in widespread ways, continually, consistently violates international law, doesn't relieve Israel of its own obligations to follow international law. Israel is still bound by international law. And I think that's the right thing morally, it's the right thing legally, and I even think it's the right thing strategically overall, even if in some cases that seems to inhibit Israeli actions that would provide some sort of important military gain. And I do want to emphasize that point. None of this, though, is to suggest that the kind of military operations that we've been talking about, targeting operations, aspects of the so-called siege, and so on, none of these things are free of controversy. The law of armed conflict and the kinds of principles that we are talking about here are what we lawyers would often call standards more than bright line rules. There are some bright line rules, things that for example, you cannot deliberately target, but proportionality, for example, requires some balancing. And I do think reasonable observers can calculate that balance differently. It's, none of what I've said here should mean that I would agree with every one of the balancing calculations that Israel has made or agree with where they would set the threshold. But I will say that the IDF has an extremely robust system of indoctrination and training in international law, one that's very, very impressive, even in comparison to some of the most militarily and legally sophisticated militaries in the world.
I have two additional questions that I want to get to, and then we will turn to our audience. I know we have many, many questions coming in from our audience. One is about the idea of a ceasefire. There's also discussion of a pause. Is there any obligation under international law for a ceasefire, or is that more of a political decision? Can you help us understand what that means? And is there a difference or a distinction between a ceasefire and a pause?
Yeah, I think generally the difference is that a ceasefire would be a prelude to some sort of a further political negotiation. A ceasefire would generally mean we are going to stop fighting so that we can try to work out some sort of agreement to end the conflict, whereas a pause would basically say we are going to, for a certain amount of time, stop firing, stop bombing, so that certain humanitarian relief goods can enter, or certain civilians perhaps can exit. And understandably, there's a lot of controversy about this. One can see how and why this might be important to relieving some of the civilian suffering. But we are also talking about a significant ongoing war where it would be militarily ineffective. It may be politically, it may be diplomatically effective. It may be effective in a humanitarian sense to issue or to engage in some sort of pause. But it is important to keep in mind that Israel, the IDF, would be giving something up in doing so at a time that it's looking to press its military operations at a very fast rate.
Thank you. So final question before I turn it back to you, Claire. When violations of law are alleged and documented, what is the international accountability here? And we all know about Nuremberg, and looking today and after what happened on October 7th, what is the role and applicability of the International Criminal Court? Can it bring cases against Hamas?
Yeah, so I think I'd first begin by saying, when it comes to enforcement and compliance with international law, I think a lot of people sort of jump to the most high profile institution, which might be the International Criminal Court. But the International Criminal Court sees very, very few cases. And so much of the action of enforcement and compliance with international law takes place through other mechanisms. I mentioned training and doctrine of military forces. And by the way, that's not to say that even if Israel trains and embeds in its doctrine very strong protections of and compliance with international law, that violations never occur. In most extended, high-intensity military campaigns, there are going to be violations of the laws of war. That is a common thing. That, by the way, not all violations of international law actually amount to war crimes. That's a sort of that's a category of especially grave violations of international law. But if violations do occur, there are a number of different mechanisms. There are domestic criminal law mechanisms. Those could be civil courts or military courts like courts martial. Foreign courts sometimes have mechanisms that could be used to prosecute foreign war crimes. There are the political, diplomatic costs that come from violations, and especially ones that are publicized. Sometimes the UN a UN body might create a commission of inquiry to try to examine what did or didn't happen. And then finally, you get to international courts like the International Criminal Court. The International Criminal Court has, for years now, asserted jurisdiction over the Palestinian territories. This has been controversial for a number of reasons, including that Israel is not a party to the International Criminal Court, that the Palestinian territories are not themselves a state. So any move to actually prosecute Israeli officials in the International Criminal Court, I think, would be an extremely, extremely fraught move by the International Criminal Court. It is theoretically possible that the ICC could take cases and try cases, undoubtedly war crimes. I think this is yet another asymmetry, though, in so far as Israel would care a lot about any of its officials being prosecuted, and I don't think Hamas would care.
Thank you. Okay, so Claire, I know we have many questions. I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Melanie. Our first question is from David Milgram, who's asking, how do you create a basis for comparing civilian loss to measures of military advantage? What, if any, is the unit of measure?
It's a great question, and there isn't really a very clear one. We're talking about, we might say comparing apples to oranges, and it's hard to even determine how you define what makes up an apple and an orange. In using that metaphor, I don't mean at all to minimize the seriousness of both sides of the proportionality calculus. Both sides are extremely important. Military necessity is obviously vital to a state, especially a state waging war in self-defense. And the humanitarian interests are obviously very, very vital. And especially in a conflict like this can be very, very grave. The result of trying to compare military necessity and humanitarian interests, for the reasons you say in your great question, both of them are very difficult to measure. And as a result, I think there is often some room for debate, especially in there's often going to be room for debate. And I think reasonable observers could make different judgments depending on how much weight they credit to each side of that balance. It's also especially difficult to measure something like military effectiveness or military necessity when you're talking about, let's say, taking out a senior terrorist leader. It's a bit easier to figure out and kind of determine objectively what is the military value of taking out 10 tanks. Harder to determine what or different people might arrive at some different conclusions about the military value of taking out a critical command node of a terrorist organization. All of which is to say, you're absolutely right. This is a very, very hard balance to assess. And it's one reason why I think it makes the most sense to think here about some very, very extreme examples. Like I said, taking out an entire residential complex in order to take out a single sniper. That would clearly be disproportionate, whereas I think reasonable observers could draw different conclusions about many cases.
Thank you. I'll try to combine two questions just based on the time. Doug Weinberg is asking, why is Hamas not considered a state actor? Wasn't Hamas elected by Gazans? And Sandra Finn is asking, so Hamas violates international law, but are there no consequences? Are the repercussions just in the court of public opinion?
Sure. So Hamas is not a state. It is, in a sense, a government. It's a heinous government, and it was indeed elected. But Hamas itself is not a state because Gaza is not a state. The Palestinian territories are still subject to. I mean, there's let's say their international legal status is contested. I'll say the Israeli position is that the contours, just the geographic contours of what might emerge as a Palestinian state is subject to continued negotiation, but the Palestinian territories are not a state. And so Hamas, even though it governs and exercises control over Gaza, is not in the eyes of international law a state. There is one quirk to this, which is I mentioned earlier, which is the International Criminal Court, in thinking about its own jurisdiction, can only accept jurisdiction, or one way in which it can take jurisdiction of a matter is if a state voluntarily subjects a conflict in which it's engaged to the International Criminal Court. The Palestinian Authority did that, and the International Criminal Court said that for the purposes of the ICC, the Palestinian territories are a state. This just goes to show that I think there's quite a lot of disagreement about international legal disagreement about the precise status of the Palestinian territories. I think the second question is what happens, what kind of accountability is there for Hamas war crimes? And I would say that sadly, the main forms of accountability are either the court of public opinion or what might be called, military neutralization. I think it is extremely unlikely that many, if any, of the perpetrators of, for example, the October 7th attacks will be brought to some sort of criminal justice. It does raise a question of if Israel does get its hands on some of the leaders, what kind of process will it do with them? But generally in these kinds of conflicts, there isn't really much in the way of formal legal accountability for Hamas leaders or fighters.
Thank you. Maria Evans in Boca is asking, does how Hamas and other terrorist organizations get their funding impact international law? Does it increase culpability for other parties?
Unfortunately, I would put it this way. There is a body of international law often referred to as the law of state responsibility. And so other states that are directly complicit in supporting Hamas's war crimes could themselves be regarded as sort of as complicit and therefore legally responsible themselves for war crimes. The main direct sponsors of Hamas is Iran, which is already an international pariah in many quarters, not throughout the world, but in many quarters. And I would say that the funding that comes to Hamas is a problem that is less likely to be solved by international law, or directly solved by international law, so much as other mechanisms like trying to dry up either Iran's capacity to fill Hamas's coffers, or somehow disrupting the means by which funds are transferred to Hamas.
Our last question before I turn it back to you, Melanie. Carol Nemo, and I'm sure many others, are saying, how can we as ordinary citizens respond to those who accuse Israel of genocide, violating proportionality, and committing war crimes? What are the key takeaways we should share with others?
I mentioned a couple before. One is I hope that there's a reluctance to jump immediately to conclusions. Amid the fog of war, there is often going to be misinformation or disinformation. The early strike of a hospital in Gaza is a great example of this. The news coverage went immediately from describing it as an Israeli attack to kind of trying that, a few hours later or 12 hours later to kind of to correct that, but a lot of that damage was done. In addition, when looking at particular strikes, I mentioned before, facts matter. What was targeted? Why was it targeted? What was the intent of that targeting? All of these things matter, and often a strike in hindsight looks very different than it may have looked in real time. And law applies to real time decision-making. So all of which is a reason why I hope there's more caution in just jumping to conclusions. Again, none of this is to minimize at all the tremendous human suffering, but if we're going to apply the law in a serious way, we need to let some of those facts emerge. Second is often international law is simply misstated. I mentioned before a very common error, which is to describe the proportionality principle as sort of an eye for an eye, a comparison of death counts. And that is simply not what proportionality means. It's a comparison of anticipated military gain, military advantage compared to the expected civilian suffering that would come from that particular operation. And often this is misstated and misapplied. The last thing is, I would mention it's, the attention needs to remain focused on Hamas's war crimes committed on October 7th and continually since then. It's quite upsetting the degree to which the global conversation has moved very fast from being about the barbaric atrocities committed on October 7th to a conversation about whether or not Israel is complying with international law. And we need to keep attention. It's not to minimize, again, I'm not saying is compliance and a debate about Israeli conduct is unimportant. It absolutely is. But I do worry that it is sometimes drowning out coverage of and publicity of Hamas's continuing atrocities.
Well, Professor Waxman, I want to thank you. This has been an extraordinarily helpful and informative hour with you. Just judging by the number of questions we received in the chat, I am going to recommend that we find perhaps another hour with you at some point in the not too distant future. I think there are still a lot of questions, including about what happens after, God willing, this war ends. Hopefully sooner rather than later, but we will save those for hopefully another day. And I just want to thank you. And with that, Claire, I will turn it back to you.
Thank you all for taking part in today's AJC Advocacy Anywhere, and thank you to our global audience for tuning in today. To stay up to date on the evolving situation, make sure to follow AJC on social media at AJC Global. We also hope you'll join us on November 14th in Washington, D.C. for the March for Israel as we show solidarity with Israel, call for the release of the hostages, and stand united against anti-Semitism. You can learn more at marchforisrael.org. Our hearts are in Israel today and every day. An Yisrael Chai. Thank you again and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.